The morning sun rose over the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, casting a pale golden glow over the dew-soaked fields. The air was brisk, carrying the scent of fresh earth and the faint aroma of smoke from the chimneys of houses still waking from the night. For Samuel Turner, a young farmer of barely 20, this was a morning unlike any other he had ever known. Today was the day he would leave his family, his home, and the life he had always known to join the ranks of the Union Army. The drumbeat of war had reached even this quiet corner of the state, and the call to arms echoed in the hearts of men who felt both pride and trepidation in equal measure. Samuel's mother, a frail woman with hands weathered from decades of toil in the fields, clutched his sleeve, her eyes brimming with tears. She could hardly speak, but the weight of her emotions pressed upon her like a physical force, squeezing her chest and leaving her breathless. She had heard the stories, the whispered rumors of what awaited soldiers on the battlefields, the filth, the sickness, the brutal reality of combat, and yet she knew her son's spirit could not be restrained. She had watched him grow from a boy with scraped knees and an insatiable curiosity into a man with strong hands and a restless heart. She knew that to deny him this path would be to deny his very essence. "Go, Samuel," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Go, and may God watch over you." His father, stoic and silent, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Samuel had inherited much of his father's temperament: quiet determination, a stubborn streak, and a sense of duty that ran as deep as the roots of the oaks surrounding their homestead. His father's eyes, hard and unwavering, softened only briefly before resuming their usual seriousness. "Make sure you write when you can," he muttered. "Keep your wits about you. The world out there is not kind, and the men you march with may not all be friends." Samuel's younger sister, Emma, barely 10 years old, clung to his arm. Her sobs shook her small body as she whispered, "Don't let them hurt you. Sammy, don't let them hurt you." He knelt down, holding her close, feeling the warmth of her tiny body and the weight of a responsibility that had never before been his. "I'll be careful," he promised. "I'll come back to you. I swear it." He wanted to believe it more than anything, though deep inside he feared he could not keep such a promise. In those moments, the reality of what he was about to undertake struck him like a hammer against stone. He was leaving behind the familiar, the comforting, the known, and stepping into a world of uncertainty, danger, and unimaginable hardship. The road to the recruiting station was longer than Samuel had anticipated. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the cobblestones themselves resisted his journey. Townspeople lined the streets, some clapping, others silently watching, faces etched with worry or pride. The air was thick with the mingled sense of horse sweat, manure, and anticipation. Young men like Samuel, with wide eyes and trembling hands, were everywhere, clutching their letters of enlistment and knapsacks filled with the bare essentials provided by the army. Some had been farmers, like Samuel, while others were blacksmiths, shopkeepers, or students. All were united by the same uncertain fate, a path that led to the front lines of a war that would define the nation. At the recruiting station, the scene was chaotic but strangely organized. Officers in blue uniforms barked orders, examined papers, and weighed the enlistment of each man, checking for physical readiness and basic literacy. The room smelled of sweat, ink, and leather, and the constant murmur of voices, coupled with the occasional shout, created a dissonant symphony of urgency and expectation. Samuel felt a strange combination of fear and exhilaration. He was about to step into history, to become part of something larger than himself. Yet he could not shake the sense of foreboding that settled deep in his chest. He was sworn in, his hand raised, repeating words he barely understood but felt the weight of deeply. The oath, solemn and binding, seemed to echo off the walls and into the very core of his being. From that moment on, Samuel was no longer merely a young man from Gettysburg. He was Private Samuel Turner of the 1st Pennsylvania Infantry, a soldier in the Army of the Union, a participant in a war that had already claimed thousands and would claim thousands more. The first days in camp were disorienting. Rows of tents stretched as far as the eye could see, interspersed with stacks of rifles, piles of firewood, and the occasional sickly moan of a man stricken with fever. The smell of unwashed bodies, wet wool uniforms, and cooking fires mingled in a pungent haze that clung to Samuel's clothes and hair. He learned quickly that life in the army was governed by strict routines. Early reveille, long drills, inspections, meals that were often little more than hardtack and salted meat, and endless hours of standing, marching, and waiting. Each day blurred into the next, the monotony broken only by the occasional harsh reprimand from a sergeant, or the sudden alarm of a cannon shot in the distance. Samuel found camaraderie in a handful of fellow recruits who shared his fears and hopes. There was Thomas, a lanky farm boy with a quick wit that belied his size. William, a quiet, introspective man who carried a small Bible and scribbled prayers in the margins. And John, a brash young man who constantly challenged authority and laughed in the face of fear, though Samuel suspected that beneath that bravado lay deep unease. Together they learned to drill, to march in formation, to care for their weapons, and to obey the seemingly endless series of commands that governed camp life. Each day brought new lessons, each night new anxieties. Letters from home became Samuel's lifeline. His mother wrote of the harvest, the illnesses in town, and the small victories and tragedies that defined daily life. Emma's letters were filled with innocent questions, drawings, and pleas for him to return safely. He read each letter again and again, savoring the familiar script and the connection to the world he had left behind. Yet the letters also reminded him of what he had sacrificed and what he could potentially lose forever. As weeks passed, the reality of war became impossible to ignore. Rumors of battles in Virginia, casualty lists arriving in camp, and letters from men who had been at the front painted a picture far darker than Samuel had imagined. The bravado of enlistment faded, replaced by a gnawing fear and the knowledge that every step forward could bring him face to face with death. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by nightmares of gunfire, screaming, and the smell of blood. Each day was a test of endurance, courage, and faith. Samuel also began to understand the harsh hierarchy of Army life. Officers and non-commissioned men demanded obedience. Punishment for disobedience was swift and unforgiving. The bonds of brotherhood among soldiers were forged through shared hardship and fear, but they were also tested by jealousy, competition, and the relentless pressure of survival. Even the simplest tasks, fetching water, maintaining a musket, standing guard, took on an intensity Samuel had never anticipated. Each decision, each misstep carried weight, for the consequences in camp and on the battlefield could be devastating. The first march to the front was grueling. Hours of trudging along rutted roads, through rain, mud, and scorching sun, took a toll on Samuel and his companions. Blisters formed on his feet, chafing turned raw, and exhaustion weighed upon him like a leaden cloak. Yet, amid the hardship, there were moments of stark beauty. The sun breaking through clouds after a storm, the quiet of a forest at dawn, the laughter of men sharing a joke despite the looming threat of battle. These fleeting moments of relief contrasted sharply with the horrors that Samuel knew awaited him, making the anticipation almost unbearable. And as the army approached the outskirts of the first engagement Samuel would face, he felt the full weight of history pressing down upon him. He understood, perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of what was to come, not just for himself, but for every man marching alongside him, for the families who had sent them, and for the nation itself. The call to arms had been answered, but the cost was yet unknown. In the quiet moments before the battle, as the wind rustled through the trees and the distant rumble of cannon fire began to grow, Samuel closed his eyes and whispered a silent prayer, that he might endure, that he might survive, and that he might one day return home to the fields, the family, and the life he had left behind. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the rolling hills as Samuel and his regiment crested the ridge overlooking the valley below. The world seemed suspended in a fragile silence, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm. Birds called occasionally, their songs ghostly against the distant echoes of artillery. For Samuel, every nerve seemed to vibrate with tension. The rhythm of his heartbeat echoed in his ears, loud and insistent, as if warning him of the chaos that lay ahead. The crisp air, which would normally have felt refreshing, seemed sharp, almost bitter, biting at his lungs and reminding him that nothing in this place was natural or kind. The valley below was a scene of organized chaos. Rows of blue-coated soldiers, men like Samuel, whose hands were steady but whose eyes betrayed fear, prepared for engagement. The gray of the Confederate forces stretched across the opposite ridge, a living wall of human intent. Flags fluttered in the wind, Shouting orders crackled through the air, and the distant thunder of cannon fire had already begun. Each explosion shook the ground, sending vibrations up Samuel's legs, making him question the very solidity of the earth beneath him. This was the reality of war, the culmination of all the training, marching, and whispered stories he had endured in camp. Now, it was no longer a rehearsal, no longer a distant rumor. It was real, immediate, and merciless. The order to advance came suddenly. A sharp blast from the bugle cut through the mist, and with a collective shudder, the regiment began its descent into the valley. Samuel gripped his musket tightly, knuckles white, as the world around him seemed to narrow. Each step forward felt like wading through water, heavy and deliberate, the ground uneven and slick with mud from recent rains. Men stumbled, fell, and scrambled to regain their footing, creating a chaotic rhythm of motion that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the iron tang of blood, and the raw scent of fear. The first volley of musket fire tore through the air, sharp and unrelenting. Samuel's ears rang, his eyes stung from the smoke that blurred vision and choked the lungs. The sound of men screaming, some in pain, some in sheer terror, created a nightmarish cacophony that seemed to stretch forever. Around him, soldiers fell, some clutching limbs that had been shattered, others collapsed entirely, the life leaving them in ragged, desperate gasps. Samuel felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach as he realized the full weight of what was happening. This was no drill, no simulation, no distant tale. This was death, present and pervasive, touching everything in its path. The first enemy soldier Samuel encountered was as human as he was. Their eyes met briefly across the smoke-filled field, and for a heartbeat, both seemed to recognize the absurdity of their circumstances. Men, strangers, and yet mirror images in fear and desperation, tearing each other apart in the name of causes larger than themselves. Then the musket discharged, a flash, a cry, and the man fell. Samuel's stomach churned, bile rising at the immediacy of life extinguished, and he forced himself to press forward, his training and raw survival instinct overriding the shock. He stumbled over a body, the man's lifeless eyes staring into the void, and felt a shiver of disbelief and horror. The battlefield became a landscape of grotesque reality. Mud mixed with blood, torn uniforms, broken rifles, abandoned knapsacks, and the incessant wail of the injured. Each step was a negotiation with terror. Every glance could meet death. The air was so dense with smoke and dust that Samuel's world narrowed to the length of his musket and the immediate presence of those around him. He could hear the shouted orders, the frantic calls for medics, the desperate prayers, and the furious command of officers trying to maintain some semblance of order amid the chaos. Hours passed like moments. Samuel could not tell if the sun had moved or if the smoke had simply shifted to obscure it, for the sky above and the ground below seemed one endless tableau of suffering. The sound of cannon fire became a drumbeat in his mind, the vibrations rattling his teeth and the very core of his being. Each volley of musket fire tore through the air, a relentless staccato of death. His body reacted in ways he had never anticipated. Trembling hands, racing pulse, and a cold sweat that soaked his uniform. Yet he could not stop. To pause was to risk death. To falter was to betray those marching alongside him. In the midst of this, Samuel witnessed acts of both unimaginable cruelty and unexpected humanity. A wounded soldier crawling through the mud reached out a trembling hand. Samuel grabbed him, dragging him to the shallow edge of a ditch where they could take cover. The man's eyes held gratitude mixed with a hopeless fear, and Samuel felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. He had acted, but the act itself did not erase the horror surrounding them. Around them, men screamed, fell, and struggled, and for every life saved, countless others were lost. The midday sun climbed higher, burning through the mist and smoke, revealing the true scope of the battlefield. Bodies lay strewn in grotesque arrangements, some partially covered by dirt, others crumpled against the jagged terrain. Horses, once proud and strong, were now silent and still, their bodies tangled among human casualties. The ground itself seemed to protest the violence inflicted upon it, churned to a muddy, blood-soaked sludge that made movement both difficult and treacherous. Samuel's boots were heavy with the wet mix, his fingers stiff with grime, and his uniform caked in filth. Every breath burned his lungs, every step threatened to unbalance him, and yet he pressed onward, driven by a mixture of fear, duty, and sheer survival instinct. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion began to set in. Samuel's legs felt as if they had turned to lead, every movement a monumental effort. The adrenaline that had carried him through the initial assault began to ebb, leaving in its place a hollow fatigue that gnawed at both body and spirit. His mind swirled with the sounds, the smells, the unending chaos, and for a brief moment, he wondered if he would ever recognize the world again if he survived this day. Around him, the sounds of battle seemed almost eternal. The crashing of cannons, the snapping of rifles, the shouts of men giving and taking orders, and the ever-present moans of the injured. It was an orchestra of horror, and Samuel was trapped in its center. Yet in this hellish landscape, Samuel also discovered resilience he had never known. He moved from one soldier to another, assisting where he could, carrying messages, dragging the wounded to relative safety, and finding moments of clarity amid the madness. Small acts of courage, throwing a canteen to a parched comrade, helping a man stabilize his broken leg, or simply offering a whispered word of reassurance, became lifelines in a world dominated by death. Each act reinforced the bond between men, the fragile thread of humanity that persisted despite the surrounding atrocity. As dusk approached, the battlefield did not quiet. Smoke clung to the valley like a dense fog, obscuring the devastation that stretched for miles. Bodies, wounded and dead, lay scattered in an almost nightmarish pattern, the living moving cautiously amid them. Samuel, his body battered and his mind frayed, found temporary refuge behind a shattered wall of stone. He pressed himself against it, shivering, his ears still ringing from the cacophony of battle. In the fading light, he could barely distinguish friend from foe, the colors of blue and gray blending into the smoky horizon. Sleep was impossible. The horrors of the day were imprinted on his mind, a vivid tapestry of terror, bravery, pain, and loss. Each scream, each flash of musket fire, each anguished cry for help, replayed endlessly in his thoughts. Samuel realized that the battlefield demanded more than courage. It demanded a mental endurance that taxed every fiber of his being. The men who survived were not merely strong. They were unyielding, capable of compartmentalizing fear and grief to function in a world where both were constant companions. As night fell, Samuel and the remaining men of his regiment huddled in whatever cover they could find, bodies pressed together for warmth and security. Conversations were few, murmured or broken by shivering and exhaustion. Some cried quietly, some prayed, others stared blankly into the darkness, trying to comprehend the scale of what they had endured. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the day pressing on him. The blood, the mud, the screams, the fire, the lost friends, and the unending threat of more battles to come. He knew deep in his soul that this was only the beginning, that the war had no compassion, no mercy, and no respite for those caught in its relentless grasp. He thought of home, of his mother and sister, of the quiet fields of Gettysburg, and he wondered if he would ever see them again. Yet even in this despair, a fragile thread of determination persisted. He had survived the first day, barely, but survived nonetheless. He had faced the raw, unfiltered reality of combat and lived to tell it, if only to himself. And in that small, fragile survival lay a promise that as long as he drew breath, he would continue, he would endure, and perhaps, against the cruel odds of war, he might yet return to the world he had left behind. The night was a strange, uneasy blanket that settled over the battlefield, muffling the echoes of gunfire and the shouts of men. Samuel Turner remained huddled behind the shattered stone wall, his body exhausted and coated in mud and blood, yet his mind refused to rest. Around him, the faint groans of the wounded punctuated the darkness, some reaching out for help that Samuel could barely provide. He had survived the first day, but survival came with a weight far heavier than the musket he carried or the pack on his back. It was the weight of memory, of conscience, and of a dawning understanding that the war would not release him from its grasp, no matter how far he marched or how many battles he endured. Hours passed, though Samuel could not tell by the movement of the moon or the subtle shifts of the stars. The battlefield seemed timeless in its destruction, a frozen landscape of horror that demanded attention yet offered none. He crawled cautiously over the uneven, blood-soaked ground, his hands brushing against the fallen, the dying, and the debris that littered the once green valley. Each step elicited a sharp awareness of mortality. Each glance confirmed the fragility of life in a place where death had claimed so many. Samuel found Thomas lying nearby, leaning against a battered tree trunk, his uniform ripped and streaked with mud and blood. The young farm boy's face was pale, eyes wide with the lingering shock of combat. "Thomas," Samuel whispered, crouching beside him. "Are you hurt?" Thomas shook his head faintly, his lips trembling. I think I'm okay. Just, I don't know. I can't stop seeing." His voice faltered, and he covered his face with a trembling hand. Samuel understood without needing the words. The sights, the sounds, the smells of the battlefield, the screams, the flashes of musket fire, the acrid scent of gunpowder mingled with blood, would haunt them both for years, perhaps for life. They moved slowly together, helping one another over the treacherous terrain. The sounds of battle had faded to a low murmur, but the air remained tense, heavy with smoke and the lingering metallic tang of blood. Around them, the aftermath revealed itself in grim detail. Horses lay crumpled, their owners nowhere to be found. Rifles were abandoned, many broken or stuck in the mud. Knapsacks torn open, spilling letters, hardtack, and personal effects into the mire. Some men had wandered off, aimless, stunned, their minds numb from the relentless onslaught of terror. Others remained huddled in small groups, tending to the wounded or whispering quiet prayers. Samuel paused near a shallow trench where a Confederate soldier lay, barely moving. Their eyes met briefly, two young men caught in the same spiral of war, yet divided by uniform and cause. Samuel's hand hesitated, and for a fleeting moment, he considered the futility of their struggle. How many more would fall? How many families would grieve? And for what? The soldier gasped, and Samuel quickly averted his gaze, moving on. There would be no time for reflection here, only action, only survival. By dawn, the first light revealed the scale of destruction with a clarity that the darkness had masked. The valley was a tapestry of suffering and ruin, each detail etched into Samuel's memory. He and Thomas continued their careful progress, occasionally stumbling over bodies, navigating around jagged tree limbs, and avoiding the slick, treacherous mud that threatened to trap their boots. They discovered pockets of Union soldiers attempting to organize small groups, tending to the wounded, and signaling for reinforcements. The camaraderie and brotherhood that had begun in camp were now tempered by the harsh reality of shared survival, a bond that was as fragile as it was vital. Samuel moved to help a wounded private trapped beneath a fallen tree. The man groaned, pain etched into every line of his face. "Hold on, sir," Samuel said, gripping the tree with Thomas's assistance, and together they managed to lift it enough for the soldier to crawl free. The effort left Samuel gasping, muscles trembling from exertion, yet the brief moment of success, saving a life, felt monumental amid the relentless tide of loss. It was a small assertion of humanity in a landscape otherwise consumed by death. As the day progressed, the soldiers began the grim task of burying the dead, a task that none approached lightly. Samuel observed silently as men carefully covered bodies with dirt, marking makeshift graves where possible. Some wept openly. Others worked in stunned silence, their movements mechanical, faces drained of color. Samuel's own hands were coated with mud and blood, and for a moment, he questioned whether he could bear the weight of so many lives taken, so much destruction wrought in mere hours. Letters and keepsakes were recovered from fallen comrades. Samuel picked up a small, mud-streaked notebook, flipping through its pages to find a young man's sketches of home, of family, of dreams interrupted by the call to arms. Each page was a reminder of the fragile humanity that war sought to crush, of lives frozen mid-motion, and of the enduring spirit that persisted even in the most harrowing circumstances. The midday sun bore down, relentless, and with it came the realization that respite was fleeting. Orders from higher command directed the surviving soldiers to regroup, to move, to prepare for the next engagement. Samuel felt the familiar tension coil within him, the same knot of fear, determination, and raw survival instinct that had driven him through the previous day's battle. Each march, Each maneuver was a test of endurance, not just of body, but of mind. Samuel's thoughts drifted briefly to his family in Gettysburg. He imagined his mother's frail hands, Emma's worried eyes, and the stoic reassurance of his father. The longing for home was a constant ache, intensified by the chaos around him. Yet the battlefield demanded presence, demanded action. There was no room for daydreams, no opportunity to indulge in nostalgia. Survival required focus, attention, and a stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. He encountered more wounded soldiers, their cries for aid growing weaker with each passing hour. Some were beyond help. Others clung to life with a desperate tenacity. Samuel dragged one man to a sheltered position, offering what comfort he could. The man's eyes met his. Gratitude mingled with fear, and Samuel realized that in these small, fragile exchanges lay the essence of resilience. War might strip men of comfort, safety, and certainty, but the capacity to care, to act, to persist, that remained. Hours bled into evening, the sun casting long shadows across the scarred landscape. Samuel and Thomas, along with a handful of other survivors, finally found a semblance of shelter. The remnants of a stone outbuilding, partially collapsed but sufficient to block the wind. They huddled together, sharing water and the last scraps of hardtack, exhausted beyond words. The silence was heavy, a silence that pressed against the eardrums after the unending cacophony of the previous day. Samuel's mind, however, would not rest. Memories of screams, of flashes of musket fire, of fallen comrades, and the sheer randomness of survival replayed endlessly. Sleep was fitful, a series of jolts and half-waking nightmares. Each time his eyes closed, he saw the battlefield spread before him, smoke rising like the aftermath of some apocalyptic fire, the cries of the wounded echoing into eternity. Yet in the midst of despair, Samuel clung to something fragile but vital, a thread of determination. He had survived, barely, but survived nonetheless. That survival was not merely a physical fact. It was a psychological, moral, and spiritual assertion. He had acted, had carried, had witnessed, and in doing so, had affirmed that even in the relentless machinery of war, humanity could persist, however tenuous. The night deepened, bringing with it an oppressive quiet. Samuel sat on the cold stone, listening to Thomas breathe beside him, and allowed himself a moment to reflect. He thought of Gettysburg, of the fields, of the morning sun rising over familiar hills. He imagined the letters he would write, the stories he would one day tell, the hope he might one day carry home. And though the weight of the battlefield pressed upon him, though the horrors of the day would linger in his mind indefinitely, Samuel understood something essential. Survival was not just a physical act, but an act of will, of courage, and of the stubborn, unyielding hope that one day, even amid the devastation, life could be reclaimed. As dawn approached once more, Samuel rose, aching but resolute. The orders came, to regroup, to march, to prepare for whatever lay ahead. The war was far from over, and the battlefield, with all its horror and sacrifice, had only just begun to reveal its demands. Yet within him burned a quiet, persistent determination to endure, to act, to survive, and perhaps one day, to return to the world he had left behind, carrying with him the memories, lessons, and burdens of what he had witnessed, endured, and survived. The morning sun barely pierced through the low-hanging mist as Samuel Turner and the surviving men of his regiment began the next march. Their bodies ached from the previous day, muscles stiff and bruised, yet the orders from the officers were clear: regroup, advance, and maintain formation. Samuel's uniform, caked in mud and streaked with blood, clung uncomfortably to his skin. Each step was a negotiation between will and exhaustion, a constant reminder that survival demanded persistence beyond mere endurance. Thomas walked beside him, his face pale but determined, eyes scanning the terrain for danger. "Sammy," he whispered, his voice strained, Do you think there are more of them waiting ahead?" Samuel did not answer immediately. The valley had revealed itself in all its horror yesterday, and the possibility of another confrontation weighed heavily on him. Yet he knew that hesitation could be fatal. "We have to keep moving," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "Whatever's ahead, we face it together." The road stretched ahead, winding through hills that rose and fell like waves frozen in time. The mist clung stubbornly to the earth, curling around tree trunks and rocks. giving the world an ethereal, almost unreal quality. Yet Samuel knew better than to be deceived by appearances. The hills might look quiet, serene even, but each shadow could conceal danger. Each sound could signal an ambush, and the landscape itself, scarred from countless engagements, bore silent testimony to the countless lives lost upon it. Their progress was slow. The mud, churned by the hooves of horses and the boots of soldiers, sucked at their feet with every step. Samuel's hands ached from gripping his musket so tightly, knuckles white, yet the rhythm of his march could not falter. Every so often he glanced at Thomas and the other soldiers around him. William, quiet and introspective, scribbling prayers into his notebook whenever there was a pause. John, brash yet cautious, scanning the tree line as if expecting an attack at any moment. Each man carried his own burdens, memories, and fears, yet together they formed a fragile chain of resilience. By midday, the regiment had crested another ridge, revealing a valley below where smoke rose in pale spirals, mingling with the mist and the scent of damp earth. From the distance came the low rumble of artillery, faint but unmistakable. Samuel's heart clenched. The war was relentless. Even when one battle ended, another waited on the horizon, ready to demand more. More courage, more endurance, more sacrifice. The officers called for a brief halt, and the men dropped to the ground wherever they could find solid footing. Samuel leaned against a fallen tree, taking shallow breaths, trying to steady his trembling hands. Around him, conversations were muted, punctuated by the occasional groan or sigh. Some soldiers closed their eyes, allowing themselves a moment's respite. Others, like John, paced restlessly, unable to quiet the storm inside. Samuel reached into his pack and pulled out a letter from his mother. The edges were damp and smeared with mud, but the familiar handwriting brought a fleeting sense of comfort. He read her words carefully, letting them seep into his weary mind. Updates about the harvest, concerns for the family, small joys and worries from home. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine the sun rising over the fields of Gettysburg, the scent of freshly turned earth, the warmth of his mother's hand. It was a fleeting vision, but one strong enough to fortify his resolve. The march resumed, the men moving in formation along narrow paths that wound through forests and across streams swollen with recent rains. Samuel's boots squelched in the mud, and his uniform clung to him like a second skin, damp and heavy. Each footfall was accompanied by the whisper of leaves and the distant, unsettling cries of wildlife disturbed by the march of men. The forest seemed alive, watching, judging, and waiting. As they progressed, Samuel's mind replayed the horrors of the previous day, the screams, the flashes of musket fire, the fallen comrades and the wounded begging for aid. Each memory pressed against him, refusing to be ignored. Yet he understood something essential. Dwelling on fear alone could paralyze, and paralysis meant death in a place like this. He steeled himself, focusing instead on the rhythm of the march, the small acts of care he could provide, the fragile camaraderie that bound them together. Around midday, the regiment encountered a small group of stragglers from another battalion, men disoriented and exhausted, some wounded and leaning heavily on companions. Samuel assisted where he could, offering water, adjusting bandages, and providing words of encouragement. The simple act of helping others, even briefly, lent him a sense of purpose amid the chaos. It reminded him that war was not only destruction and death, it was also, paradoxically, the assertion of humanity, the stubborn insistence that even in the most hellish circumstances, men could act with care and courage. The sun climbed higher, burning through breaks in the mist and casting sharp shadows across the landscape. The heat added to the physical strain, and the men's clothing clung uncomfortably, soaked with sweat and the lingering dampness of early morning fog. Samuel's throat was dry and his muscles protested with every step, yet the orders were clear. Advance. There was no choice, no reprieve. Survival demanded movement, vigilance, and an unwavering determination to endure. As the afternoon progressed, the regiment reached the outskirts of another small settlement, abandoned but bearing scars of previous skirmishes. Samuel observed carefully, noting the barricades, the ruined homes, and the occasional abandoned weapon. The village, though quiet now, whispered warnings of what might come. The remnants of conflict were everywhere, and each structure, each shadow, could conceal danger. The men moved cautiously, inspecting the buildings, clearing paths, and establishing temporary positions. Samuel found himself repeatedly scanning the horizon, heart racing, muscles taut. Every noise, a sudden rustle, a creak of a door, the faint echo of a distant shout, triggered instinctive reactions honed by the previous day's ordeal. It was a relentless exercise in vigilance, a test of both endurance and sanity. By evening, the regiment had set up a temporary camp along the edge of the settlement. Tents were sparse and the ground uneven, but it provided some semblance of shelter. Fires were lit carefully, small and controlled, offering warmth and a chance to cook meager rations. Samuel sat beside Thomas, sharing a small portion of bread and water, the silence between them heavy but understood. Each man's thoughts were his own, yet there was a shared understanding that bound them together. They had survived. For now, and tomorrow demanded the same courage. As night fell, Samuel wandered to the edge of the camp, gazing at the hills beyond. The mist rose once more, curling through the valleys like ghostly fingers. Memories of fallen comrades returned unbidden, faces etched in his mind's eye, screams and prayers mingling with the wind. He pressed his hands to his face, trying to stave off the waves of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Yet in that struggle, he also recognized a profound truth. Survival was not merely a physical act, it was a moral, emotional, and psychological assertion. To persist, to act, to endure. This was itself a triumph, however fragile or fleeting. Hours passed in fitful vigilance. The men slept in shifts, though rest was shallow and punctuated by nightmares. Samuel's mind replayed the march, the small victories, the acts of care, and the relentless pressure of survival. Each sound of the night, a snapping branch, a distant cry, reminded him of the fragility of life in this world, and the constant proximity of death. In the darkest hours before dawn, Samuel allowed himself a brief meditation. He imagined Gettysburg, the rolling fields, the familiar faces of his mother and sister. He imagined letters he would someday write, stories he might tell, and the hope that one day, this relentless march, this unending series of trials, might lead him back home. It was a fleeting vision, yet it fortified his spirit, reminding him why he endured, why he moved forward, and why he would continue to do so, despite the relentless horrors that war demanded. When the first light of morning broke, it revealed the valley once more, scarred and silent. The regiment prepared to move, aware that the road ahead promised no respite, no mercy, and yet also no certainty of failure. Samuel adjusted his musket, tightened the straps of his pack, and took a deep breath. He would face whatever came next, armed not only with training and instinct, but with the knowledge that he had endured, that he had acted with courage and humanity, and that survival demanded nothing less than unwavering determination. The march resumed, slow and arduous, yet resolute. The hills rose and fell before them, each crest promising new challenges, new dangers, and new tests of courage. Samuel walked among his comrades, their faces a mix of fatigue, fear, and determination. Together they formed a fragile but unbroken line, a chain of resilience forged in mud, blood, and shared survival. As the day wore on, Samuel noticed the subtle changes in the landscape. Trees scarred by previous battles, streams carrying remnants of debris, and the distant sound of artillery echoing faintly across the hills. Each detail reinforced the reality that the war was unending, that every step carried consequence, and that the persistence of life in this world was itself an act of defiance against the machinery of destruction. By late afternoon, the regiment reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley, the next potential battlefield. Samuel's muscles screamed in protest, yet he felt a grim sense of anticipation. He surveyed the terrain carefully, noting the rises, the wooded patches, and the winding streams. Each feature of the landscape could offer advantage or peril, and every decision mattered. Samuel's thoughts turned again to Gettysburg, to home, and to the fragile hope that one day he might return. Yet the present demanded attention. Orders were given. Scouts would advance to survey the valley below, and the regiment would establish a temporary defensive line. Samuel prepared himself, mentally and physically, for the tasks ahead. The evening settled over the hills, painting the world in muted shades of gray and gold. Fires burned in controlled patches, men tending them quietly, sharing what food they could spare. Samuel sat beside Thomas, sharing a rare moment of calm amid the relentless tension. "We'll make it," Thomas whispered, almost to himself. Samuel nodded, though he did not speak. Survival demanded more than words. It demanded action, vigilance, and endurance. And as night deepened, he resolved that he would continue, that he would persist, and that whatever trials lay ahead, he would meet them with courage, humanity, and the stubborn hope that one day he might return home to the life he had left behind. The morning mist had barely lifted when Samuel Turner and the regiment began their cautious descent into the valley below the ridge they had camped upon. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, carrying the smell of wet earth, smoke, and the lingering metallic tang of blood from the previous skirmishes. Every step Samuel took was deliberate, each movement accompanied by the constant tension that had become almost instinctual. He gripped his musket tightly, knuckles white, eyes scanning every shadow and flicker of movement among the trees and rocks. Thomas walked beside him, his face pale but resolute. "Do you feel it?" he whispered almost too quietly for the others to hear. "Something's off." Samuel nodded, sensing the same unease. The valley seemed too quiet, the normal sounds of wildlife strangely absent. Even the wind seemed to have paused, leaving an unnatural stillness that pressed upon their shoulders like a physical weight. He knew better than to trust appearances. The battlefield had taught him that quiet could be more dangerous than any cannonade. As they descended toward Hollow Creek, a narrow waterway snaking through the valley, the soldiers' steps became increasingly cautious. Every fallen tree, every jagged rock, every rustle of leaves set nerves on edge. The valley floor was uneven, broken by shallow ravines and thick patches of brush that obscured visibility. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat, a steady drumbeat against the oppressive silence. Suddenly, a sharp crack rang out, a rifle shot, precise and deadly. The first man in their column went down instantly, his body crumpling into the mud. Shouts erupted, orders mixed with panic, and the valley erupted into chaos as more shots followed. The ambush was immediate, and the men had little time to react. Samuel dove behind a fallen log, his musket raised, scanning for targets. Smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder filled the air. Around him, comrades shouted, returned fire, and tried to reorganize amidst the panic. He saw John beside him, crouched low, eyes wide with both fear and determination, firing at fleeting glimpses of gray uniforms moving through the trees. Samuel's hands shook, but he forced himself to focus. Every second mattered. Every decision could mean life or death. The first volley tore through the regiment, leaving men screaming and collapsing into the mud. Samuel pressed forward, firing where he could, dragging the wounded into relative cover. He reached a young private whose leg had been shattered by a bullet. "Help me!" the boy gasped, eyes wide with terror. Samuel grabbed him under the arms, Thomas assisting from the other side, and together they dragged him behind a small ridge of earth. The boy's weight was heavy, yet heavier still was the crushing reality that they could not save everyone. Amidst the chaos, Samuel noticed the skill of the Confederate soldiers. They moved swiftly, using the terrain to their advantage, firing from concealed positions, and retreating before the Union soldiers could respond effectively. Every instinct Samuel had developed in camp and on previous marches was tested to its limit. He felt fear, raw and unrelenting, but alongside it came a sharpened awareness, a clarity born of necessity. Survival demanded action, not hesitation. Hours seemed to pass in what could only have been minutes. The ambush pressed relentlessly, and Samuel and his companions fought in a disjointed rhythm, responding to threats as they appeared, retreating when necessary, and holding their ground where possible. The cries of the wounded, the barked orders of officers, and the relentless sound of musket fire created a cacophony that disoriented the senses. Samuel's ears rang, his vision blurred by smoke, yet he forced himself to move, to act, to endure. In the midst of the firefight, Samuel spotted a Confederate soldier aiming at Thomas. Instinct took over. He raised his musket and fired, the shot connecting, and the soldier fell. Thomas looked at him, eyes wide, and Samuel felt a rush of conflicting emotions, relief, fear, and the bitter awareness of what survival required. Every life saved came at the expense of another. Every act of courage carried the shadow of consequence. By mid-afternoon, the ambush began to lose its momentum. The Confederate forces, realizing the Union regiment was adapting to the terrain and returning fire effectively, began to retreat toward the wooded hills beyond the creek. Samuel, Thomas, and the remaining men took the opportunity to regroup, tending to the wounded and securing a small defensive position along the creek's bank. Mud, blood, and sweat clung to every surface. Exhaustion pressed upon them like a physical force. Yet there was no time for reprieve. Samuel knelt beside the young private they had rescued, examining his injuries as best he could. "Stay with me," Samuel murmured, pressing a makeshift bandage to the boy's leg. The child's eyes were wide with fear and pain, yet he nodded, gripping Samuel's hand weakly. Samuel's chest ached, not just from fatigue, but from the bitter awareness of how fragile life had become in this relentless theater. Around them, the battlefield bore the marks of struggle. Fallen trees, shattered rifles, and the scattered belongings of soldiers created a chaotic mosaic of destruction. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some partially covered by mud, others exposed to the harsh light of the sun. Samuel could not linger long. The threat of further engagement was ever present, and the survival of the regiment depended on vigilance, discipline, and unyielding resolve. As evening approached, the regiment established a temporary camp along a ridge overlooking Hollow Creek. Fires were lit cautiously, small and controlled, providing warmth and a chance to cook minimal rations. Samuel sat beside Thomas, exhausted, muscles trembling, eyes scanning the darkening tree line for any sign of renewed attack. Conversation was sparse, punctuated by murmurs of prayer, expressions of grief, and the occasional whispered reassurance. Samuel's mind drifted, as it often did, to Gettysburg. He imagined the morning sun over the familiar fields, the scent of fresh earth, the warmth of his mother's hand, and the small, earnest face of Emma. The thought brought a fleeting comfort, a fragile reminder of what he was fighting to survive for. Yet it also deepened the ache of longing and the awareness of the price exacted by war. Night fell, bringing with it the oppressive silence of uncertainty. Samuel remained awake for long hours, sitting near the fire, listening to the subtle sounds of the valley. The distant cry of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional groan of a wounded soldier. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by nightmares of gunfire, screams, and the faces of those lost in the ambush. Each time his eyes closed, the memory of Hollow Creek replayed endlessly, a relentless reminder of the unpredictability and cruelty of combat. By the first light of dawn, Samuel rose, stiff and aching, muscles protesting, yet his resolve remained unbroken. Orders were given to prepare for further movement, the next march already looming, and the reality of the campaign settled heavily upon him. Each day brought new trials, new dangers, and new opportunities to test courage, endurance, and humanity. Samuel adjusted his pack, gripped his musket, and joined his comrades, walking once more into a world where survival demanded more than skill or strength. It demanded the unyielding assertion of will, and the quiet, stubborn hope that one day this relentless ordeal might end and he might return home. The morning fog lingered thick over the valley, wrapping the landscape in a damp, ghostly shroud. Samuel Turner adjusted the straps of his pack, the leather rubbing against his raw, aching shoulders, and gripped his musket with hands that were stiff from yesterday's march and the ambush at Hollow Creek. The valley was silent now, the echoes of musket fire from the previous day replaced by an oppressive stillness that pressed down on the men as they moved in formation. Each step forward demanded vigilance. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that flickered through the trees, could signal danger. Thomas marched beside him, silent, jaw set, eyes scanning the dense undergrowth that flanked the narrow path. "Sammy," he murmured finally, "I can't shake the feeling that something's watching us." Samuel nodded without answering, understanding the unease that had settled like a stone in their stomachs. They had entered what the officers called the haunted forests, a stretch of dense woodland known to be treacherous both for the terrain and the enemy's tactics. Every fallen log, every twisted root, and every shadow could conceal an ambush. Samuel's senses were heightened to an almost painful degree. Each sound, a snapping twig, a distant bird call, a sudden gust of wind, triggered the instincts honed by months of marching, fighting, and surviving. The regiment moved cautiously, single file where the path narrowed, boots sinking into the damp earth, leaving deep impressions in the mud. The smell of wet soil, rotting leaves, and lingering gunpowder from previous skirmishes filled the air, a constant reminder that this forest had already been a site of death and struggle. Men whispered prayers under their breath, offered quiet reassurances, and adjusted their grips on weapons. Every step forward a negotiation with fear. By late morning, they encountered the first signs of enemy activity, a set of disturbed underbrush, the faintest impressions of hooves and the glint of metal reflecting sunlight through the trees. Samuel froze, signaling to Thomas, and together they crouched low, scanning the area. The regiment halted, officers whispering orders, and the tension tightened like a drawn bowstring. Each soldier's mind raced, anticipating attack, imagining threats, and preparing for the inevitable clash. The first shots came suddenly, echoing through the trees, sharp and relentless. Samuel dove behind a fallen log, the musket heavy in his hands but familiar from use. Around him, comrades returned fire, the air filled with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Screams erupted from men struck by bullets, cries of pain and commands blending into a chaotic symphony that seemed almost alive. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline sharpening his senses, his mind operating with a clarity born of necessity. He saw John crouched behind a tree, firing rapidly at the glimpses of gray moving through the undergrowth. The man's bravado remained intact, though Samuel knew better than to mistake it for absence of fear. Fear was everywhere, a tangible presence that shaped each action and reaction. Samuel's muscles ached, his chest burned from exertion and the tension, yet he forced himself to move forward, dragging a wounded soldier to relative cover. The boy's leg was pinned beneath a fallen branch, and Samuel's efforts to lift it left him breathless. But the act itself provided a momentary reprieve from the chaos, a small assertion of control in a world otherwise dominated by random violence. Hours passed in what seemed both a heartbeat and an eternity. The ambush continued in waves, the Confederate soldiers using the terrain to their advantage, retreating and reappearing, forcing the Union regiment to respond in kind. Samuel felt the full weight of responsibility pressing upon him, not only for his own survival, but for those around him. Each decision carried consequence. Hesitation could mean death for himself, for Thomas, for the wounded, for the regiment as a whole. During a lull, Samuel found a small clearing and allowed himself a moment to breathe, examining his surroundings. Trees bore scars from musket fire, leaves were torn and scattered, and the ground was churned to a slick mixture of mud and blood. He looked at the men around him, their faces pale and drawn, eyes wide with exhaustion and lingering terror. Some whispered prayers. Others sat in silence, staring at the ground as if it could offer understanding or respite. Samuel's own thoughts drifted briefly to Gettysburg, to his mother, to Emma, and he imagined letters he might one day write, describing what he had seen, what he had endured. The thought was bittersweet, offering comfort, yet emphasizing the gulf between the life he had left behind and the one he was forced to endure. As the day wore on, the regiment advanced deeper into the forest, each step fraught with danger. Snipers hidden in the trees forced men to hug the ground, return fire carefully, and move only when absolutely necessary. Samuel's arms ached from holding his musket for prolonged periods, his eyes stung from smoke and sweat, but his determination did not waver. Survival depended on action, vigilance, and a constant awareness of the environment, and he had learned to rely on instinct honed through months of relentless experience. Mid-afternoon brought another shock. A sudden explosion, an improvised trap set by the enemy, sent dirt and debris flying, scattering men in all directions. Samuel was thrown to the ground, ears ringing, vision momentarily blurred. His body ached, bruises forming from the impact. Yet he forced himself to rise, scanning the area for Thomas and the others. Around him, cries of the wounded mingled with commands from officers attempting to reorganize the regiment. Samuel felt a surge of resolve. This forest, this ambush, this relentless war, they would not break him. He moved through the chaos, helping where he could, offering words of encouragement, and physically assisting those unable to continue. The work was exhausting, draining every ounce of strength, yet each small act of care reinforced the fragile chain of humanity that persisted even amidst death. Samuel's thoughts continually returned to home, to Gettysburg, yet he understood that the present demanded total attention. Nostalgia had no place here. Only action, only survival, only endurance. By evening, the regiment managed to push through the forest, emerging onto a small plateau overlooking another valley. The men were battered, exhausted, and haunted by the day's events, yet they had survived. Fires were lit in makeshift pits, rations distributed sparingly, and the wounded tended as best as possible. Samuel sat beside Thomas, sharing a small portion of water and bread, the silence between them heavy but understood. Samuel's mind wandered as he looked across the valley. The forest they had traversed lay behind, scarred and ominous, and ahead stretched more unknown terrain, filled with uncertainty, danger, and the ever-present threat of enemy engagement. The weight of responsibility pressed upon him, the faces of the men around him reflecting exhaustion, fear, and resilience. He knew that each step forward would test them further, that the war demanded more than courage or skill. It demanded unwavering endurance, a capacity to act amidst chaos, and the ability to maintain humanity in a world determined to strip it away. Night fell with oppressive quiet, broken only by the occasional groan of a wounded soldier or the distant howl of wildlife. Samuel lay awake for long hours, muscles sore, mind racing, reflecting on the day's events and the constant fragility of life in this relentless campaign. He thought of Gettysburg, of home, and allowed himself a fleeting vision of sunlight over the familiar fields, the smell of fresh earth, the warmth of his mother's hand, and the small, earnest eyes of Emma. These thoughts, though brief, sustained him, a fragile lifeline in a sea of chaos and despair. As the first light of dawn approached, Samuel rose with the others, ready to continue the march. Orders had already been given: advance cautiously, maintain formation, and prepare for the next engagement. He adjusted his pack, gripped his musket, and scanned the horizon, muscles aching, body bruised, yet spirit unbroken. Each day demanded more than physical strength. It demanded resilience, vigilance, and an unyielding assertion of will. Samuel knew that the march through the haunted forests was only the beginning of what lay ahead. More ambushes, more battles, more loss awaited. Yet in the endurance of the present, in the acts of courage and humanity he could perform, lay a testament to the resilience of men, the stubbornness of hope, and the possibility, however fragile, of returning home. With Thomas at his side, John pacing cautiously and William quietly praying, Samuel led himself forward into the unknown, determined to survive, to endure, and to act with the courage and humanity that had sustained him thus far. The forest behind them was a memory of horror, the valley ahead, a test yet to be faced. And Samuel understood, with a clarity sharpened by exhaustion, fear, and determination, that survival was not simply a matter of skill or luck. It was a deliberate, unyielding act of will, sustained by hope, by humanity, and by the quiet, persistent belief that one day the war would end, and life, however changed, might resume once more. The morning was deceptively calm, a fragile veneer over the tension that gripped the men of Samuel Turner's regiment. After days of marching through the haunted forests, ambushes, and relentless skirmishes, the Union soldiers had reached the Blackwater Ford, a shallow but wide crossing over a sluggish, muddy river. The water reflected the pale light of dawn, calm and silent, yet Samuel knew better than to trust appearances. Rivers were natural obstacles, but in times of war, they could also be death traps, perfectly concealed positions for sharpshooters, sudden artillery fire, or unexpected enemy maneuvers. Samuel tightened the straps of his pack, feeling the damp fabric against his shoulders, and checked his musket, the weapon familiar now, almost an extension of his arm. Beside him, Thomas crouched low, scanning the tree line across the water, eyes narrowed against the glare of the early sun. "Sammy," he whispered, voice low and tight, "do you feel that?" The stillness. It's like the forest is holding its breath. Samuel nodded, understanding the weight of the silence. For months, the men had learned that nature itself could become an accomplice to death. The absence of sound was not peace, it was anticipation. Every rustle of leaves, every glint of sunlight on metal, every ripple in the water could signal danger. And in this quiet, Samuel felt the familiar, gnawing tension that had become almost permanent in his chest. A mixture of fear, anticipation, and determination that sharpened his senses and guided every step. The regiment advanced cautiously, stepping into the shallow banks of the river. The water was cold, seeping through the fabric of boots and trousers, chilling the men to the bone. Samuel's muscles protested, stiff from days of forced marches and ambushes, Yet he moved steadily, eyes forward, scanning the far bank and the surrounding woods. Each man was acutely aware of the potential for sudden attack, their training and instincts honed to respond instantaneously to threats. Halfway across the ford, the first shots rang out, sharp, sudden, and deadly. Confederate soldiers concealed among the trees along the opposite bank opened fire with rifles, sending bullets whipping across the surface of the water. Samuel dropped to one knee, returning fire with precise aim, adrenaline surging through his veins. Around him, men shouted, ducked, and fired, the sounds of battle mingling with the rush of water, creating a chaotic symphony of survival. John, crouched beside a partially submerged boulder, shouted orders over the roar of musket fire, directing men to advance carefully and use the terrain for cover. William, ever the quiet observer, moved methodically, offering prayerful murmurs to the wounded and keeping track of the regiment's cohesion amid the chaos. Samuel's eyes flicked from friend to foe, tracking the movement of enemy rifles, the trajectory of musket balls, and the positions of his companions. Each decision, each motion, carried immediate consequences. Bullets splintered the water around them, striking stones and trees with sharp cracks, sending fragments in unpredictable directions. Samuel felt the sting of mud and water against his exposed skin, the cold a constant reminder of his vulnerability. One of the younger soldiers in his unit cried out, clutching his shoulder, blood staining the brown fabric of his uniform. Samuel lunged to help, dragging the boy to relative cover behind a partially submerged log. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, and Samuel pressed a hand to his shoulder, murmuring words of reassurance he hoped would reach the child beneath the panic. Hours seemed to pass in the stretch of minutes and seconds dominated by gunfire and chaos. The regiment inched across the ford, using rocks, fallen logs, and shallow banks for cover. Samuel's breath came in short, controlled gasps, his muscles trembling from exertion and the cold. Yet each step was deliberate, each movement informed by a growing awareness that survival was not a matter of chance, but of careful, continuous action. By midday, the regiment had successfully crossed the majority of the river, though at significant cost. Several men had fallen, their bodies dragged to temporary cover, while others clutched wounds, faces pale and eyes wide with shock. Samuel paused beside a small rise of earth, scanning the opposite bank and the surrounding woods for signs of further attack. The Confederate soldiers had begun to retreat, recognizing the resilience and determination of the Union men. But the danger was far from over. The water of Blackwater Ford, once calm and reflective, now churned with mud, debris, and the occasional body. Samuel's boots were slick with blood and water, his uniform soaked through, and yet he felt a grim satisfaction. The regiment had crossed, and each man who survived the ford was a testament to their shared courage, discipline, and endurance. Officers quickly organized the men into defensive positions along the far bank. Fires were small, controlled, and used sparingly, the scent of wet wood and gunpowder mingling in the humid air. Samuel crouched beside Thomas, sharing a small portion of hardtack and water. They did not speak much. Words were unnecessary. The shared understanding between them was profound, unspoken, and grounded in the knowledge that the next hours would test them further, that survival demanded vigilance, and that the fragility of life in this war was constant and absolute. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the regiment encountered another challenge. The terrain beyond the ford rose sharply, a series of ridges and gullies providing perfect cover for potential enemy forces. The officers ordered reconnaissance, sending small groups ahead to assess the land and locate possible threats. Samuel volunteered, moving with Thomas, John, and William as scouts, hearts pounding, muscles taut, and senses heightened to the limits. The forested ridges were a maze of shadows, the underbrush thick and tangled, every step fraught with danger. Samuel's eyes flicked constantly, scanning for movement, glinting metal, and any sign of enemy activity. The men moved cautiously, communicating through hand signals and whispers, each aware that a single misstep could expose them to deadly fire. Hours passed with tense observation and careful movement. They found traces of previous Confederate positions, abandoned ammunition, torn uniforms, and shattered rifles, all silent testimony to battles fought and lives lost. Samuel's chest tightened at the sight of these remnants. They were reminders of mortality, courage, and the indiscriminate nature of war. Yet they also provided crucial intelligence, offering the regiment a chance to prepare for what might come. As night approached, the scouts returned to the main body of the regiment, reporting their findings. Officers organized defensive positions along the ridges, setting up lookouts and carefully rationing remaining food and water. Samuel, Thomas, John, and William settled into a small clearing, exhausted but alert. Fires were kept low to avoid detection, and the men shared what little food they had. The taste of hardtack and dried meat a small comfort against the pervasive fatigue and tension. Samuel's thoughts drifted to Gettysburg, as they often did in moments of quiet. He imagined the familiar fields, the scent of fresh earth, the warmth of his mother's hand, and the small, earnest face of Emma. The thought brought both solace and pain. Solace in the memory of home, and pain in the awareness of how distant it now seemed. Yet even as he imagined these scenes, he resolved that he would survive, that he would continue to endure, and that he would honor the courage of those around him by pressing forward, no matter the hardships to come. Night fell with oppressive weight. The sounds of the river, distant wildlife, and the occasional groan of a wounded soldier created an uneasy symphony. Sleep was shallow, punctuated by dreams of gunfire, screams, and faces both familiar and lost. Samuel lay awake for long hours, muscles aching, mind alert, listening to the quiet and the distant threats that might emerge from the darkness. Each sound, each movement could signal death, and he knew that vigilance was as crucial at night as during the relentless daylight marches. As dawn approached, Samuel rose with the others, muscles stiff, body bruised, yet spirit unbroken. Orders had already been given. Prepare for the next movement, advance cautiously, and maintain formation. Samuel adjusted his pack, gripped his musket, and scanned the horizon. The river behind them was a battlefield of memory, scarred and dangerous. The ridges ahead promised further challenges, and Samuel knew, with a clarity honed by fear, experience, and determination, that survival demanded more than courage. It demanded unyielding will, precise action, and the quiet persistence of hope, a fragile yet vital thread that could carry him through the horrors of war toward the possibility of home. With Thomas at his side, John pacing carefully, and William offering quiet prayers, Samuel prepared to lead himself forward once more into uncertainty, danger, and the unending demands of survival. The ford was crossed, but the war continued, relentless, unforgiving, and absolute. And Samuel understood that to endure, to act, and to survive was itself an assertion of humanity against a world that had shown him nothing but death, chaos, and challenge. The morning sun rose dimly over the horizon, its rays struggling to penetrate the dense smoke and fog that clung to the rugged hills of Redcliffe Heights. Samuel Turner adjusted his wet and caked uniform, muscles stiff and sore, from the relentless march over uneven terrain and the precarious ford at Blackwater. The regiment had moved cautiously through the forests, surviving ambushes, treacherous crossings, and the exhaustion of continuous vigilance. Now they faced Redcliffe Heights, a commanding ridge overlooking the valley below, a position of strategic importance fiercely defended by the Confederate forces. Samuel's chest tightened as he surveyed the ridge from a small crest. The slope was steep, dotted with jagged rocks, fallen trees, and makeshift fortifications. Smoke rose from the enemy's positions, mingling with the morning mist, creating an almost ethereal yet ominous veil. Cannon placements glinted under the sunlight. Musket fire could be heard in distant skirmishes, and the air carried a metallic tang that reminded Samuel of every wound he had witnessed, every life he had seen extinguished over the past months. Thomas came up beside him, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the terrain. "Sammy," he said in a low, tense voice, This is worse than anything I imagined. Look at the slope. They're ready for us." Samuel nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. "We'll have to move carefully," he replied, voice tight. "Every step, every shot counts. We can't afford mistakes." The regiment prepared to advance. Officers barked orders, arranging men in staggered formations to navigate the rugged hillside. Samuel checked his musket, ensuring the flint and powder were ready, and adjusted the straps of his pack that pressed against bruised shoulders. The men around him were tense but determined, their faces pale from exhaustion and fear. yet their eyes reflected a grim resolve. As they began the ascent, the enemy opened fire. Cannonballs whistled through the air, striking the ground with explosive force, sending dirt, rock, and debris into the air. Musket volleys tore through the ranks, bullets ricocheting off rocks and trees. Samuel dropped low, firing as he advanced, each shot deliberate, calculated. The ground shook with each impact, every explosion a stark reminder of the stakes. Men around him fell, cries of pain and terror filling the air. Samuel felt the sting of a bullet grazing his arm, but he forced himself onward. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. Mud, blood, smoke, and sweat mingled in a disorienting haze. He saw John to his left, crouched behind a boulder, firing rapidly, eyes wide but unwavering. William moved with quiet efficiency, attending to wounded soldiers, murmuring prayers as he stabilized their injuries as best as possible in the midst of battle. Hours passed in a blur of fire, smoke, and exertion. The regiment pressed upward, inch by inch, under relentless bombardment. Each rise of the slope revealed new threats: enemy sharpshooters hidden in the crags, cannon fire from elevated positions, and sudden volleys from concealed musket nests. Samuel's muscles ached, his lungs burned from exertion and smoke inhalation, yet he continued to move forward, relying on instinct, training, and the sheer will to survive. At one point, a shell exploded nearby, sending Samuel sprawling to the ground, dirt and rock pelting his uniform and bruising his skin. His ears rang, vision blurred, yet he scrambled upright, dragging a wounded soldier behind a partially fallen wall of stones. The boy's face was pale, eyes wide with terror, but he clung to Samuel's arm, drawing strength from the act of rescue. Samuel's chest heaved as he pressed forward, aware that moments of courage, acts of humanity, were both lifelines and burdens in this relentless fight. By midday, the regiment had reached the lower fortifications of Red Cliff Heights, but progress was painfully slow. Cannon fire had decimated the ranks, musket volleys from elevated positions created kill zones, and the uneven terrain slowed every movement. Samuel felt the weight of exhaustion, fear, and responsibility pressing upon him, yet he could not stop. Survival demanded forward motion, quick thinking, and unyielding resolve. The men improvised as they advanced, using fallen logs, rocks, and shallow depressions for cover. Samuel fired when he could, moved wounded comrades to relative safety, and maintained constant awareness of the enemy's positions. Each step was a negotiation with death. Hesitation or error could be fatal. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, blood, sweat, and the faint, haunting stench of decay from the previous battles on the ridge. Hours melted into one another, the rhythm of combat unrelenting. Samuel witnessed both courage and horror. A young private, no older than 15, dragged himself forward, firing when possible, driven by the will to survive and the training instilled by months in the field. Another man, struck in the leg by a cannonball, screamed in agony, yet continued to crawl, determined not to be left behind. Samuel helped where he could, offering words of reassurance amidst the chaos, aware that hope, even the smallest thread, was a powerful motivator in the hellscape of battle. By late afternoon, the Union forces had secured partial control of the ridge, but the cost was immense. Many men lay dead or wounded, the cries of the injured mingling with the distant rumble of artillery. Samuel's body was covered in mud and blood, muscles trembling with fatigue, yet his mind remained sharp, attuned to every movement, every sound. Survival had become almost instinctual, eyes scanning, muscles reacting, heart steady, yet every beat reminding him of fragility. As dusk approached, the regiment attempted to consolidate positions along the ridge. Fires were lit sparingly, small defensive structures reinforced, and the wounded tended as best as possible. Samuel sat beside Thomas, sharing a few bites of hardtack and a sip of water. Neither spoke much. Exhaustion and tension held their tongues. Around them, men whispered prayers, offered quiet comfort, or stared into the fading light with blank eyes, processing the day's horrors and their own tenuous survival. Samuel's thoughts drifted, as always, to Gettysburg. He imagined the morning sun over the fields, the smell of fresh earth, the warmth of his mother's hand, and the small, earnest eyes of Emma. These memories were both a balm and a torment, a reminder of life beyond the war, and a painful acknowledgement of how distant that life now seemed. Yet even in his longing, a stubborn thread of determination persisted. He had survived, adapted, and acted with courage, and he knew that each moment of survival was a testament to resilience and hope. Night fell with oppressive quiet. The ridge was haunted by shadows, every noise amplified, every movement suspect. Samuel lay awake for hours, muscles stiff, mind alert, listening to the distant sounds of enemy movement, the occasional cry of a wounded soldier, and the faint rumble of artillery in the valley below. Sleep was fleeting, haunted by visions of the day's combat, the screams, the flashes of musket fire, the smell of blood, the terror in the eyes of the men around him. By the first light of dawn, Samuel rose with the regiment, muscles aching, body bruised, yet spirit unbroken. Orders were already given. Reinforce positions, prepare for enemy counterattack, and remain vigilant. Samuel adjusted his pack, checked his musket, and scanned the horizon. The ridge was only partially secured. The enemy still held strong positions, and the war continued, relentless, unforgiving, and absolute. Samuel understood, with a clarity born of months in the field, that survival required more than courage. It demanded unyielding will, careful calculation, the quiet persistence of hope, and acts of humanity amidst the chaos. With Thomas at his side, John cautiously patrolling the perimeter, and William tending to the wounded, Samuel led himself forward into the uncertainty of Red Cliff Heights, aware that the war would continue to test every limit of body, mind, and spirit. Every step, every breath, every heartbeat was an assertion of life against the overwhelming presence of death. And Samuel, battered but resolute, pressed onward, determined to endure, to protect his comrades, and to preserve the fragile thread of humanity that clung to him even in the darkest moments of war. Dawn broke with a reluctant gray light over the scarred landscape of Red Cliff Heights. Samuel Turner, muscles stiff and bruised from the previous day's relentless siege, adjusted his wet, mud-caked uniform and gripped his musket with the familiarity of a longtime companion. The ridge stretched out before him, a panorama of destruction. Shattered trees, churned earth, and the silent testimony of men who had fallen in the hours of relentless combat. Smoke rose in thin ribbons, mingling with the morning mist, while the scent of blood, gunpowder, and sweat clung to the air in an almost tangible haze. Samuel scanned the ridge with a meticulous eye. Enemy positions, partially destroyed but still formidable, dotted the uneven terrain. Cannon emplacements had been silenced, yet musket nests remained, concealed among rocks and debris. Each rise, each fallen tree, each shadow in the mist could conceal an ambush. The soldiers moved cautiously, every step deliberate, every glance alert. Samuel felt the familiar tension in his chest, a taut, unyielding cord that had been his companion for months, tighten as he adjusted his stance and prepared for the day ahead. Thomas approached, moving with the same careful precision. "Sammy," he murmured, voice low and strained. "They'll be coming back. They always do. We can't let them push us off this ridge." Samuel nodded without speaking. Words were superfluous in the shadow of the ridge, where each man's actions spoke louder than any declaration. The previous engagements had carved deep lessons into the regiment's consciousness. Vigilance, coordination, and relentless effort were not just strategies. They were necessities. The regiment began to fortify its positions. Sandbags were hastily stacked, fallen logs rearranged, and earth dug to provide rudimentary cover. Every man moved with the grim understanding that the enemy would strike again, and that delay or hesitation could be fatal. Samuel worked alongside John and William, moving swiftly and efficiently, reinforcing positions while scanning for threats. Bullets whizzed overhead, ricocheting off rocks, and the occasional cannon blast from the valley below reminded them that the danger was never distant. Hours passed in meticulous preparation. Samuel's hands ached, his fingers stiff from mud and rope burns. But the act of reinforcing defenses offered a fragile reassurance. Every log stacked, every sandbag placed was a minor victory against chaos. Around him, men whispered prayers, offered words of encouragement, and shared quiet reassurances. Even amidst exhaustion and fear, the human connection, the shared struggle, provided sustenance stronger than food or water. By mid-morning, the Confederate forces had regrouped. Scouts reported movement along the distant hills, signaling the preparation of an assault. Officers called the men to readiness, instructing them to hold the ridge at all costs. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest as he tightened his grip on his musket, eyes scanning the landscape, aware that the next hours could very well determine life or death for himself and the men around him. The attack began suddenly. Artillery fire erupted, echoing through the valley with deafening intensity. Cannonballs tore through the ranks of trees and splintered rocks into deadly shrapnel. Musket fire followed, sharp and relentless, each shot a potential harbinger of pain or death. Samuel dropped behind a hastily reinforced wall, firing when he could, muscles trembling with the exertion of combat, mind focused entirely on survival and protection of the ridge. Men around him fell, screams slicing the smoky air. Samuel's eyes caught the motion of a young private, no older than 15, struggling to reload his musket while clutching a bleeding arm. Samuel lunged, helping the boy into cover, whispering reassurances that seemed fragile against the chaos. John fired furiously, taking careful aim at enemy positions, his bravado intact, yet tempered by the sharp awareness of mortality. William moved among the wounded, murmuring prayers and offering what comfort he could. The quiet presence a stark counterpoint to the noise and terror surrounding them. The ridge became a theater of relentless chaos. Bullets tore through earth and flesh alike. Cannon fire shook the ground beneath their feet, and the smoke of powder and fire obscured vision. Each step, each motion, each breath carried weight, the very air charged with the tension of life and death. Samuel's senses were hyper-alert, the snapping of twigs, the glint of metal, the subtle movements in the smoke, all could signal the next threat. Hours dragged on, yet passed with the speed of panic-fueled moments. Samuel moved tirelessly, alternating between firing, reinforcing positions, and assisting the wounded. His muscles burned, lungs ached, and exhaustion clawed at the edges of his consciousness. Yet the regiment pressed on, fueled by duty, fear, and the stubborn thread of hope that survival was possible. By mid-afternoon, the enemy had reached the lower slopes of the ridge. Hand-to-hand combat erupted, a nightmarish tangle of bayonets, fists, and desperation. Samuel fought with grim determination, each thrust and parry an assertion of life against the omnipresent shadow of death. Around him, men screamed, cried, and roared, their voices a raw testament to human resilience and suffering. He witnessed acts of unimaginable courage and horror. A soldier shielded a comrade from a bayonet, sacrificing himself in the process. Another dragged a wounded officer to cover under a hail of bullets. Samuel himself lifted a man trapped under a fallen beam, mud and blood coating them both, and moved him to relative safety. Each act was a small defiance of the overwhelming violence, a fragile assertion of humanity amid the chaos. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows over the ridge, yet the battle raged. Samuel's uniform was soaked in blood and sweat, his body trembling from exhaustion, and his mind pushed to the brink of comprehension. Sleep, food, and warmth were luxuries long forgotten. His only focus was the ridge, the men beside him, and the relentless demand to endure. By evening, the regiment had held the ridge, but the cost was staggering. Bodies lay strewn across the landscape, the wounded moaned in pain, and the living were haunted by the memories of friends lost, the cries that would never cease, and the unending terror of combat. Samuel sank to the ground beside Thomas, muscles quivering, breathing shallow, and closed his eyes for the briefest respite. In that fragile pause, he reflected on everything: the forested ambushes, the Blackwater Ford, the siege of Redcliffe Heights, the faces of friends lost, the courage of strangers, and the faint memory of home. Gettysburg seemed impossibly distant, yet the thought of his mother, Emma, and the quiet fields gave him a reason to endure, a thread of hope against the relentless tide of war. Night fell with oppressive darkness. Fires were lit cautiously, the wounded tended as best as possible, and the men huddled close for warmth and security. Samuel lay awake for hours, listening to the moans of the injured, the distant movement of enemy forces, and the whispered prayers that rose like fragile threads into the night. His mind was a battlefield in itself, replaying the day's horrors, the screams, the flashes of musket fire, and the stark reality of mortality. With the first light of dawn, Samuel rose again. Muscles ached, body bruised, mind frayed, yet determination remained unbroken. Orders had been given. Hold the ridge, prepare for further assault, and maintain vigilance. Samuel adjusted his pack, gripped his musket, and scanned the horizon. The ridge, once a symbol of tactical advantage, had become a crucible of human endurance, a place where courage, fear, loss, and determination converged. He understood, with a clarity born of relentless trial, that survival required more than strength. It demanded unwavering will, precise action, and the quiet persistence of hope. With Thomas at his side, John patrolling, and William tending to the wounded, Samuel prepared to continue, to endure, and to act with humanity amid the chaos. Every breath, every heartbeat, every step was an assertion of life against the overwhelming presence of death. The ridge was held, but the war was far from over. Samuel knew the next hours, days, and battles would demand everything from him, yet he was ready. He had endured forests, rivers, and sieges. He had faced death and horror and acted with courage and compassion. And in that endurance, in the persistence of hope, he found the fragile promise of survival, and perhaps one day return to the home and family that awaited him in Gettysburg. The morning sun rose over a landscape both familiar and irreparably altered. Samuel Turner moved through the remnants of the battlefield, the ridge of Red Cliff Heights behind him, the forests that had concealed ambushes and death now silent, empty, and still. Smoke lingered in patches, curling in thin spirals that seemed almost contemplative against the fragile light. The scent of gunpowder, blood, and decaying earth clung to his uniform, a tangible reminder of the horrors endured. Samuel's hands shook slightly as he gripped his musket, not from fear, but from the persistent tension of months of combat, the residual echoes of lives lost and chaos survived. The regiment had been ordered to regroup, to march slowly back toward safer territory. Samuel walked beside Thomas, who adjusted his pack with a weary hand, eyes scanning the horizon with the quiet vigilance that had become instinctual. John followed closely, his usual bravado muted, replaced by a solemnity born of the same relentless experience that had shaped Samuel. William moved methodically behind them, tending to the wounded who could walk, offering quiet prayers as he did so. Every step toward home was both a relief and a challenge. The terrain, though no longer immediately under fire, reminded them that war's scars extended far beyond the battlefield. Fallen trees, churned earth, and abandoned equipment marked the path, a reminder of everything the soldiers had endured. Samuel noticed the bodies left behind, some partially buried, others just markers of chaos, and he felt a gnawing sorrow. Each one represented a story abruptly ended, families left without sons, brothers, and fathers. The magnitude of the war's cost pressed heavily on his chest, yet he continued step by step, driven by the promise of home and the determination to survive. The march back was slower than any previous journey. Men's bodies were bruised, sore, and infected with fatigue that no rest could truly erase. Conversations were sparse, voices carried only when necessary. Samuel's mind wandered off into Gettysburg, to the fields that had seemed endless in their tranquility, to the smell of fresh earth after rain, to the familiar warmth of his mother's hand and the bright, anxious eyes of Emma. These memories were fragile, delicate threads of comfort that he clung to amid the persistent tension, a tether between the horrors behind him and the hope of life ahead. They crossed small streams, forded shallow rivers, and navigated forests where every snapped twig could have once meant death. Samuel's senses, trained and honed over months of survival, remained alert. He noted the subtle signs of wildlife returning, the patterns of birds and insects, the faint rustle of leaves, each a small reassurance that life, however altered, persisted. The world outside the regiment's immediate presence seemed peaceful. Yet Samuel understood that peace was temporary, a fragile illusion constantly threatened by human conflict. By midday, the regiment paused at a small clearing. Men tended to minor injuries, repaired equipment, and shared what little food remained. Samuel sat with Thomas and John, the three of them silently eating hardtack, each lost in their own thoughts. William moved between the groups, offering water, administering basic first aid, and murmuring prayers for those still too weak or injured to continue. The regiment had survived, and yet survival was a complex tapestry of luck, skill, courage, and sheer endurance. Samuel felt the weight of all those elements pressing upon him. A quiet understanding that each breath he took was earned, each step forward a small defiance of death itself. As evening approached, the landscape shifted. Rolling hills gave way to the familiar outskirts of Gettysburg. Samuel's chest tightened. Houses appeared in the distance, smoke curling from chimneys, fields stretching into familiar patterns, roads leading toward his home. Each sight was both comforting and alien. The world had moved forward, indifferent to the suffering endured, yet it remained a symbol of the life he had fought to preserve. The approach to the town was cautious. The regiment remained vigilant, knowing that even in relative safety, danger could appear unexpectedly. Samuel's mind, however, wandered increasingly toward the personal, toward the reunion with his family, toward the warm embrace of familiarity after months of chaos. Each step brought memories of Gettysburg back into sharper relief. The morning sun over dew-soaked fields, the gentle rustle of the wind through the oaks, the faint aroma of bread baking in his mother's oven. When they finally entered the outskirts, townspeople had gathered. Faces, many filled with relief and awe, watched the weary soldiers return. Samuel's eyes searched the crowd, heart pounding with anticipation. He saw familiar figures at last. His mother, frail yet resolute, her eyes scanning until they found him. Emma, clutching the edge of her dress, eyes wide with hope and disbelief. His father, standing stoic, hand extended, a silent acknowledgement of survival and pride. Samuel felt a wave of emotion, raw and uncontainable, pressing against the constraints of months of endurance. He ran forward, dropping his pack, and embraced his mother first. She clung to him with a strength that belied her frailty, tears streaming freely. Samuel felt the ache of separation, the pain of uncertainty, and the relief of reunion all merge into one overwhelming sensation. Emma joined, wrapping her small arms around him, her sobs muffled against his chest. His father placed a firm hand on Samuel's shoulder, eyes reflecting the pride and the solemn acknowledgement of the cost of survival. "You've come back," his father said quietly, voice taut with emotion. "You've truly come back." Samuel pulled back slightly, looking at the faces of his family, the fields stretching behind them, and the town he had left months ago. He felt the weight of everything endured: the rivers, the fords, the ridge, the sieges, the dead and wounded, the endless march through forests and valleys. The war had taken much, but it had not claimed him entirely. The lessons of courage, endurance, and humanity, forged in the crucible of battle, remained within him. In the days that followed, Samuel began the slow process of reintegration. He worked alongside his father in the fields, finding a rhythm both familiar and healing. Emma's laughter, once distant, became a source of comfort, a reminder of life's fragile joys. Letters were exchanged with comrades who had survived, each one a testament to persistence and the bonds formed in adversity. Samuel also spent time reflecting on the fallen, writing names in journals and silently honoring their courage. The war had changed him irrevocably, yet it had also instilled a profound appreciation for life, resilience, and the enduring power of hope. At night, Samuel would sit on the porch, looking out over the fields of Gettysburg, the moon casting silver light over familiar patterns of earth and grass. The memories of the battlefield remained, vivid and unyielding: the cries, the smoke, the flashes of musket fire, and the faces of comrades and strangers alike. Yet these memories no longer paralyzed him. Instead, they coexisted with the present, informing his understanding of sacrifice, endurance, and the quiet resilience that defined survival. Samuel's journey had been defined by relentless struggle, moments of unimaginable terror, and acts of profound courage. He had faced the raw essence of war and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken in spirit. Each dawn, each field tilled, each interaction with family and townspeople became a reaffirmation of life, of continuity, and of humanity. The threads of Gettysburg, home, family, memory, and hope had endured the storm of war, and Samuel, with his body and soul tempered by the trials of battle, embraced them fully. The town, the fields, the family, these were no longer distant ideals but living, breathing reality. Samuel understood that while the war might have ended for him, the scars remained, the lessons endured, and the responsibility to honor the sacrifices of the fallen persisted. Every sunrise, every breath, every step across the familiar soil of Gettysburg became a testament to survival, to resilience, and to the enduring promise that even in the darkest times, hope and humanity could persist. And so Samuel Turner, once a young farmer with scraped knees and a restless heart, now a seasoned soldier, stood in the quiet evening light, surveying the fields of his home. The war had taken, broken, and taught, but it had also returned him to life, to family, and to the enduring world he had fought to survive. In the embrace of home, amidst the familiar sounds and smells of Gettysburg, Samuel found not only relief but a profound understanding that courage, endurance, and humanity were the truest victories of all. The sun set over the fields, casting long shadows that stretched into the horizon. Samuel remained standing, musket laid aside, heart heavy with memory, yet lightened by reunion. The battlefields of the past whispered their lessons, and he carried them forward, not as burdens, but as guides. The war had ended for him, yet its essence remained, the knowledge that life, though fragile, was precious, and that each day offered the chance to live fully, with courage, compassion, and hope. Samuel Turner turned toward his home, the silhouettes of his family welcoming him, and took the first steps across the fields of Gettysburg, knowing that he had survived not only the war, but the testing of his own humanity. And in that survival, in that return, he found peace,